Welcome to Secret Art of Space-Time, a podcast about ideas, culture, and spirituality. My name is Andy. I hope you enjoy this show. Hello! So quickly, before we get going today, I'm super excited to share that the doors are now open to join my practice-based membership, The Secret Art. We're going to be meeting multiple times a month. I'm going to be sharing guided meditations, energy work for psychic development, and astrology circles for working with astrology in a really practical, intangible way. There will be an introduction to working with astrology if you're newer to it, but if you know some astrology already, there will be lots of opportunities to deepen your knowledge. We're all going to be learning how to track transits to our natal chart. And so we're going to be working with the archetypes as they unfold in real time through real life examples of what's playing out in our own lives. So if you think you could benefit from support and community in stabilizing and developing your own spiritual practice and psychic development, I really hope that you'll join us. I'm so excited for what we're going to co-create together. There's more info in the link in the show notes, and I hope to see you there. Hello. I want to talk a little bit about practice because I really think practice is the most important part of a spiritual life. You know, we could have all the theory in the world. We could have read all the books. We could have all the greatest teachers. But if we're not practicing, then we're not putting any of that knowledge or information into practice, right? We're not embodying it. We're not really learning how to make use of it in our lives. I think maybe this topic might feel a little bit boring to some people. But the results aren't boring, right? It's like there may be a little bit of boredom even in thinking about practice and perhaps also in engaging in practice. But the results are so worth it, right? If we're willing to even maybe see the boredom and feel it for a moment. Because that's a part of practice too, right? Like in a meditation practice, for example, it's very common to have a sense of boredom come up. And in certain contexts, yes, our boredom can be a signal that we're meant to move on or, change our focus or, do something else. But in other contexts, our boredom is actually an invitation. It's almost like a gate. Sometimes I see boredom, especially in the context of spiritual practice, as a gateway. Let's talk about meditation, and I'll weave in talking about other practices as well. But in meditation, for most of us, if we're going to sit silently with ourselves with no distractions for 20 minutes, 40 minutes, an hour, whatever it is, it's very common that we'll have a moment of boredom. But if we're able to actually be with the boredom and even get curious about it itself, what does this boredom feel like? Oh, interesting. I'm feeling bored. Are there sensations in my body that come along with that? What happens if I just sit here and be present with even boredom? And something really magical happens when we do that. Because for most of us, this boredom comes up because we're so accustomed in this culture to constant distraction and stimulation and dopamine hits. And our systems become accustomed to that. So when we disengage from all of that, boredom might come up to signal, go get another dopamine hit. Go scroll on social media. Go find some like hyperstimulation, right? But if we resist that for a moment and just get curious about the boredom and sit with it, very often we move through that moment of boredom and something opens, a deeper presence, a deeper embodiment. And then the most simple things become interesting. So that's why I often think of boredom in this context as a sort of gateway. If we're actually willing to walk through that gate and be bored for a moment, then we can enter this realm in which we become more aware, more present, and we start to notice subtlety and nuance and truly the magic and the mystery that is always with us in every moment, right? Of course, in our spiritual life, we often, or we at times, have these peak experiences, or awakening moments or spiritual experiences that are so out of the ordinary and so surprising and so interesting. But if we make our spiritual life about chasing that, then it becomes just another form of materialism. So those peak moments may arise, but they often arise actually as a byproduct of learning how to be more present in ordinary life, primarily through practice, right? Which means being able to go within, becoming more present, noticing what is, even when it's not exciting. But the paradox, of course, is that when we're willing to do that, this mystical, magical realm opens up to us. Okay, so I barely even started talking about practice. And then this energy of boredom was already coming in. It was like, I sort of had this sense that maybe some people listening may already have been having that sense of like, oh, this is a boring topic. I don't even want to listen to this episode. So it felt relevant to address it right off the bat. But let me back up a bit and come back to practice itself. There are so many different kinds of practice, right? Every spiritual tradition has multiple practices, right? Practice is an essential part of spirituality. And personally, I love practice. I feel like I'm a bit of a collector of practices. I just have so many different kinds of practices like in my back pocket. So I do want to talk about the sort of, vast array of practices on offer. But I want to begin with meditation, in part because meditation is where I began. It was my first spiritual practice, and it was my entryway, I suppose, into spirituality itself. I started meditating, more than 20 years ago. At the time, really, because I was struggling with depression and anxiety and, just like regular neuroses. And I was studying science at the time, and I was like deep into the sciences. I was working on a graduate degree in cognitive neuroscience and like very much in this kind of logical, rational, even materialist kind of mindset. but I was struggling psychologically, and I didn't want to take medication if I didn't need to. I wanted to explore other options first. And so I thought I'd try meditation. And at the time, what really attracted me to meditation, I started by studying Zen Buddhism. And what really drew me to that practice and that tradition was how scientific it is. It's very much, particularly Zen, it's very much like, here's a practice, you try it, and then you observe what the results are. It's even framed in this kind of scientific experimental way where it's like, we don't need to tell you the outcome. We don't need to give you any theory. This isn't about metaphysics. It's just a practice. You go off, you try it, and you see. And given my scientific background, that really appealed to me. And so I did. And that is almost this, that is very similar to the scientific method itself, but applied to the individual, right? To the subjective, to the psychological, to the inner world, right? If we were to think of like, how would we explore our inner life experimentally, scientifically? Well, this would be it, right? Through practice. Just like in the scientific method, some scientists will develop a particular experimental process and then share their results. And they'll say, this is the process so that, and then other scientists will, read their write-up so that they can follow the same method and see if they get the same results, right? It's very much like that. And so I did. I learned about Zen Buddhism, but more than anything else, I tried the practice. And you know what? It worked. It worked in the sense that it changed my experience for the better. At the time, I wasn't really that interested in spirituality. I just wanted a way to cope, essentially. I didn't want to feel so bad. I didn't want to be in so much pain. Oh yeah, now that I'm like remembering that time in my life, it wasn't just psychological pain. I also had an enormous amount of chronic physical pain. I had this kind of chronic pain for most of my life, and I could never figure out a source for it. But I did find that meditation actually eased that pain in a way that at the time really didn't make sense to me, but I observed it, right? It was working. And I was just happier also as I was practicing meditation. Now, more than 20 years later, I see meditation as a foundational practice. But there's so much more as well that we can explore and learn and practice. This is a bit of a hot take. It's my opinion. Not everyone's going to agree, and that's okay. I do see meditation as foundational in the sense of being almost necessary. Like, it's too strong to say it's absolutely necessary. I know there are plenty of people who are very developed spiritually, don't have a meditation practice. So there are, of course, always many different paths, but at least for me and in the way I think and the way I teach in my own life, and also in terms of what I would recommend or suggest to other people, I would say start with meditation. Because meditation truly is about presence. It's about practicing presence. And most of us, probably all of us, but let's say most of us, need that practice. And it's really only from presence that any other practice or modality or, spiritual experience can arise or can exist, right? Presence is the foundation. So practicing presence is foundational. Now, again, my opinion, a bit of a hot take. I know a lot of people say, like, XYZ is my meditation, right? Walking is my meditation. Swimming is my meditation. Playing the guitar is my meditation. Those all may be meditative, but allow me to be controversial for a moment. They're not meditation. Meditation is a very specific practice. There are multiple different methods of meditation, and they're all very specific. And yes, in Zen, there is a form of walking meditation as practice, but it's not like walking outside, going for a walk, letting your mind wander. It's very specific, like walking very, very slowly in a small circle, with very intense focus and presence. But sitting in a quiet place for a certain amount of time without movement, focusing inward, that's something that really we can't do if we're engaged in something else, right? If we're walking in the woods, it may be very calming, it may be therapeutic, it may be a spiritual practice for you, but it's not the same as a meditation practice. Now, I also don't think that meditation is enough for most people at some point in their journey, right? So it can be a very profound practice for many years, and it can be so profoundly helpful that for some people it really becomes not quite addictive, but almost. Like there can be such an attachment even to it, which is ironic, of course, because meditation truly is about releasing attachment. But at that point in someone's journey, let's say someone has been meditating every day for 10 years, it actually may be appropriate for them to explore other forms of practice on top of that meditation. So maybe cut down the time that you're spending on meditation in order to explore other practices. And the reason for that is that meditation offers presence. It helps us overcome attachment, which can free us up psychologically enormously. It truly does offer freedom, peace of mind. But at some point on our spiritual journey, most of us realize that we don't want to simply sit in presence. We actually want to do something. We want to transform. We want to move energy. We want to heal. And all of those things require different practices, right? Where we start to work with energy, where we learn how to clear, we learn how to transmute, we learn how to heal. All of those things are possible, but meditation isn't quite the right approach to achieve those things. I do think of practice in a very broad sense. I think that philosophy is a form of practice, writing is a practice, anything creative is a form of practice, journaling is a form of practice, tarot is a practice, astrology is a practice, energy work, shamanic work, dance, breath work, yoga, tai chi, qigong, right? There are so many different kinds of practice. And what's practice for? It's for life. We're practicing for life, right? It's about cultivating how we want to be in our lives, cultivating a certain mindset, a certain energetics, a certain way of thinking and being and doing so that we can live well. That's the simple way to put it, right? So we can live well. So we can learn how to be free of inner turmoil. So we can cultivate peace, inner peace, right? So we can cultivate equanimity and presence and care and compassion and love and literally anything else, right? We get to choose what we practice. I used to teach yoga, and sometimes I would say to my students, what are you practicing? Like right now, right in this moment, what kind of state of mind and state of being are you cultivating? Are you practicing? Right? Because if we approach our practices from a place of force and pushing and overdoing it, then that's what we're practicing, right? If we approach our practices from a place of being sort of half-hearted about it, or undisciplined, or lazy even, then that's what we're practicing, right? So it's not just about going through the motions of some practice. It's what are we cultivating through that practice? And I can say without exaggerating at all that practice has saved my life. I do not know how I would have survived without meditation, yoga, spiritual philosophy. And then, so many other practices came after that, which, added to my life. But those were the ones that really, truly saved me. Because there were periods in my life where I was struggling so much, like really depressed, so anxious, bad insomnia, intense chronic pain. And there were multiple periods where I didn't know if I wanted to keep living, truly. And I know without a doubt that it's practice that not only allowed me to keep going, but that allowed me to transform so profoundly that I don't encounter that kind of pain anymore, physical or spiritual or psychological. I want to say I'm a totally different person, but of course, I'm not really. I'm just more of myself. But all that agony isn't there. And, a social political analysis is important, right? There are all kinds of injustices and obstacles that people face. But that doesn't mean that we have no say in our lives. And it also doesn't mean that we have no responsibility for our lives. The care of the self in this way, through practice, through tending to inner life, is a privilege, right? It takes privilege to have the time and the wherewithal and the education to do it. But it's also a responsibility, right? To the extent that we have the privilege, it's our responsibility to tend our own inner life so that we can contribute to the world in a better way, right? It's not either or. It's not, we become so self-focused that, we're not caring about others. It's quite the opposite. And I'm using this phrase, care of the self, because this is how Foucault talks about like how the ancient Greeks practiced in ancient philosophy. I've mentioned that philosophy has been part of my own practice. And I mean, I'm an amateur. I'm not like a professional philosopher, obviously. But engaging with philosophy, in my own way, has also been really important in my own practice. Like, I have a very active mind, and I don't believe there's anything inherently wrong with that. Sometimes in the spiritual world, there's this idea that gets tossed around that like we're trying to get rid of the mind or suppress it or overcome it. And I really don't buy that. I think the mind is beautiful, and it can be rather unwieldy and unruly, at times, particularly without practice, without discipline, right? But philosophy is a way of working with the mind in an intentional way. And, not all philosophers see it this way, but there is a tradition of viewing philosophy as therapeutic, right? It's like for those of us who do think a lot, we can sometimes get ourselves caught up in these loops of thought that they're almost like these tangled knots where, through philosophy we can go in and think through it and kind of parse and start to untangle the knots and release some of that inner mental tension. It's like, I don't remember the exact quote, but Wittgenstein said something to the extent of oh shit, how did he say it? It was like, I'm gonna have to look it up. I can't remember how he put it. Just a sec. I wish I could find the quote. Okay, I can't find it, but it was something to the extent of like, the point of philosophy is to stop doing philosophy. Like, we only need philosophy when our mind is kind of in a knot. And the reason for the knot is because there's some form of inconsistency or some way we're thinking about something that's wrong or not logical or not clear. And through philosophy, we can kind of sort that out so that the knot goes away and then we don't need philosophy anymore. So I hope I'm adequately representing at least the idea, even if I don't have the words. But I love that. And I have found that to be so essential for me on my path, is that work of sorting through those mental knots so that I can find peace of mind, or at least a little more peace of mind, right? One of my favorite books, it's a text of a series of lectures that Foucault gave called Hermeneutics of the Subject. And Foucault was really interested in exploring not just the concepts from ancient Greek philosophy, but like, how did they actually practice? How did they actually engage with philosophy? And well, that's one of the points he's making in this text, is that they didn't approach philosophy as a purely intellectual exercise, but as a practice. Not just as an intellectual practice either, but as a series of practices for, as he puts it, caring for the self. So he argues that care of the self is a more correct translation of self-knowledge, or know thyself, right? So we all know thyself from ancient philosophy. But Foucault is saying, when you actually go back and really look at the texts in detail, they weren't really talking about knowing the self in a conceptual way, but actually forming the self, tending to the self, but also actually creating the self, literally creating the self through practice. And, there were all kinds of different practices that the ancient Greeks engaged in. Like one example that he uses is the practice of envisioning your death so that it helps you to put your life in focus, right? So really facing your death in such a tangible way that it's actually a practice where you actually imagine, being on your deathbed or dying, so that it helps you to be more present in your current life. It helps you to put your priorities into order. It helps you to appreciate every moment because we truly don't know how long we have. So that's just one of many, many, many different practices that the Greek philosophers engaged in as a form of caring for the self, the subject, right? Okay, I stepped away from the recording for a moment because I wanted to pick up my copy of the hermeneutics of the subject, and just kind of leaf through it to remind myself about it. And I came across this quote that I want to read. So I think this is in the introductory lecture. Okay, so he writes, I think we could call spirituality the search, practice, and experience through which the subject carries out the necessary transformations on himself in order to have access to the truth. We will call spirituality then the set of these researches, practices, and experiences, which may be purifications, ascetic exercises, renunciations, conversions of looking, modifications of existence, etc., which are not for knowledge, but for the subject's very being, the price to be paid for access to the truth. That's interesting. Spirituality postulates that the truth is never given to the subject by right. The truth is not given to the subject by a simple act of knowledge, which would be founded and justified simply by the fact that he is the subject, and because he possesses this or that structure of subjectivity. It postulates that for the subject to have right of access to the truth, he must be changed, transformed, shifted, and become, to some extent and up to a certain point, other than himself. The truth is only given to the subject at a price that brings the subject's being into play. It's a really interesting way of thinking of spirituality. It's not quite how I've been thinking of it, but it makes me think. I find it interesting. And I think he's framing it in this way because philosophy has been so concerned with truth, right? And philosophy has tended, at least in the last few centuries, to see truth as a purely cognitive exercise, right? A purely intellectual exercise. So Foucault is contrasting philosophy in this intellectual sense from a more spiritual philosophy. And, he's talking about ancient Greek philosophy as practice, as spiritual, right? Which is different from our current understanding of philosophy, right? Which involves practices and transformation. And so, whereas, many contemporary philosophers, particularly analytic ones, will see truth as a matter of logic and evidence and reason, right? This more spiritual take on philosophy will see truth as the outcome of spiritual practice. I think that's really interesting. I'm still leafing through this text, and it's interesting that he is establishing this connection between care of the self, right? This spiritual practice, right? And and politics. He's saying they absolutely aren't separate. And he's drawing on Plato and other ancient Greek philosophers. He's saying that in this tradition, the political self was seen as requiring this spiritual and practical dimension. So he says, by taking care of oneself, one makes oneself capable of taking care of others. There is, if you like, a functional relationship between taking care of the self and taking care of others. I take care of myself so that I can take care of others. I practice on myself what the Neoplatonists call catharsis, and I practice this art of the cathartic precisely so that I can become a political subject in the sense of someone who knows what politics is and as a result can govern. The care of the self finds its reward and guarantee in the city's salvation. One saves oneself inasmuch as the city state is saved, and as much as one has enabled it to be saved by taking care of oneself. The circularity is clearly set out in the construction of the Republic. Oh. I'm going to read this longer passage that I found because it's so interesting and relevant to so many of the things that we talk about here. Again, talking about the relationship between spirituality and politics. Okay, so he says, I should probably be referencing page numbers, and I'm sorry I haven't been doing that, but I'll try to do it in the future just in case anyone, I don't know, has the text or wants to find these quotes or just for reference. It's probably a good idea. Okay, so this is page 251. And it's a Picador publication. Okay. So he says, I think that we cannot fail to be struck by the fact that this theme of return to the self has basically been reconstituted, but in fragments and scraps, in a series of successive attempts that have never been organized in the overall and continuous way that it was in Hellenistic and Roman antiquity. The theme of return to the self has never been dominant for us as it was possible for it to be in the Hellenistic and Roman epoch. To be sure, there is an ethics and also an aesthetics of the self in the 16th century, which refers explicitly, moreover, to what is found in the Greek and Latin authors I'm talking about. I think Montaigne should be reread in this perspective as an attempt to reconstitute an aesthetics and an ethics of the self. We could also take up the history of 19th century thought a bit in this perspective. Here, no doubt, things would be much more complicated, ambiguous, and contradictory. However, a whole section of 19th century thought can be reread as a series of difficult attempts to reconstitute an ethic and an aesthetics of the self. If you take, for example, Stirner, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, dandyism, Baudelaire, anarchy, anarchist thought, etc., then you have a series of attempts that are, of course, very different from each other, but which are all more or less obsessed by the question, is it possible to constitute or reconstitute an aesthetics of the self? At what cost and under what conditions? Or should the ethics and aesthetics of the self ultimately be inverted in the systematic refusal of the self, as in Schopenhauer? In short, there's a question here, a series of problems which could be raised. At any rate, what I would like to point out is that after all, when today we see the meaning, or rather the almost total absence of meaning, given to some nonetheless very familiar expressions which continue to permeate our discourse, like getting back to oneself, freeing oneself, being authentic, etc. When we see the absence of meaning and thought in all of these expressions we employ today, then I do not think we have anything to be proud of in our current efforts to reconstitute an ethic of the self. And in this series of undertakings to reconstitute an ethic of the self, in this series of more or less blocked and ossified efforts, and in the movement we now make to refer ourselves constantly to this ethic of the self without ever giving it any content, I think we may have to suspect that we find it impossible today to constitute an ethic of the self, even though it may be an urgent, fundamental, and politically indispensable task. If it is true, after all, that there is no first or final point of resistance to political power other than in the relationship one has to oneself. Ooh, okay, I love this so much. If it is true that there is no first or final point of resistance to political power other than in the relationship one has to oneself. I'm going to keep reading because this is good. In other words, I need my other glasses. Oh my god. Guys, okay. I got my nails done and I can't do anything. I can't open my glasses case. I got it. Okay, here we go. In other words, what I mean is this. If we take the question of power, of political power, situating it in the more general question of governmentality, understood as a strategic field of power relations in the broadest and not merely political sense of the term, if we understand by governmentality a strategic field of power relations in their mobility, transformability, and reversibility, then I do not think that reflection on this notion of governmentality can avoid passing through, theoretically and practically, the element of a subject defined by the relationship of self to self. Although the theory of political power as an institution usually refers to a juridical conception of the subject of right, it seems to me that the analysis of governmentality, that is to say, of power as a set of reversible relationships, must refer to an ethics of the subject defined by the relationship of self to self. Quite simply, this means that in this type of analysis I have been trying to advance for some time, you can see that power relations, governmentality, the government of the self and of others, and the relationship of self to self constitute a chain, a thread, and I think it is around these notions that we should be able to connect together the question of politics and the question of ethics. There is no first or final point of resistance to political power other than in the relationship one has to oneself. Okay, I want to set Foucault aside, but sort of also keeping that in mind as inspiration, right? I don't want this to become, an attempt to really dig into the details and try to really understand every word that Foucault was saying, because that's not the point of this episode, right? This is an episode on practice. But I do want to explore a little bit more this link between politics and practice, spiritual practice in particular. And if we do understand spiritual practice as a way of relating to oneself, a way of modifying, transforming oneself, a way even of coming more into oneself, right? And Foucault, of course, is critical of our ways of speaking of this, right? Like being authentic, being oneself. And, for good reason, because, we say these things sometimes too easily without always really considering what they mean. And yet at the same time, if we throw out all that language, then we throw out some important ideas as well. And I do think there is something about spiritual practice as helping us to come more into ourselves, allowing us to be truly authentic, be truly who we are, right? To work through the distortions, the conditioning, the negative self-talk, all of that stuff so that we can be centered in who we really are. I'm sure Foucault would be critical of this, but that's okay. We can set him aside for now. But, being able to stand in that is really the only thing that will allow us to have a politics that is more just and ethical and decentralized, because to the extent that we don't have a relation to ourselves, we haven't done that inner work, and we may have very little inner life at all, right? Then that makes way for political power to become distorted and tyrannical, to put it simply. And there is kind of this move culturally to erase the self completely through first a theoretical understanding of reality in which all is matter, and therefore the self is just imaginary. It is just illusory, right? If we take a purely materialistic understanding of people, then we would be seen as kind of automatons, right? Just this sort of emergent artifact of how particles interact with each other, and then selfhood is really illusory in that context. And it is absolutely true that humans have been rather self-focused and self-absorbed, but that is not the same thing as having a relationship to oneself, as caring for oneself, as developing spiritually, right? Those are two very different things, but sometimes they're conflated, right? Sometimes spirituality is seen as navel gazing, when in fact it's quite the reverse. But if we have this perspective on humanity as being merely material, being merely biological, right? As right, there is this kind of philosophical move towards posthumanism. And in one context, it makes a lot of sense because we have to decenter the human. We have to really understand and live by our interconnectedness with all beings, and understand that we're part of an ecosystem, right? That we rely on the earth and all of life, that it's an interconnected web, and that we're certainly not at the center of it, nor are we at the peak of some kind of hierarchy, right? So decentering the self and the human is really important in that context. But I do see this kind of thinking kind of sometimes leading in a different direction that moves closer to transhumanism, or at least making way theoretically for transhumanism in erasing selfhood, right? In seeing selfhood as merely incidental, merely illusory. And so if we erase the self theoretically in this way, that makes way for tyrannical political power, right? Because the self doesn't matter, the self's experience, like individual experience doesn't matter, individual freedoms and rights don't really exist in that kind of framework, right? All that matters is whatever the political system decides is what matters, right? Which is probably like efficiency, resource management, population control. And literally anything can be justified in that kind of theoretical frame. So some branches of posthumanist philosophy, I think, don't go in this direction, but some do. And, I really agree with Foucault, at least in this context, that this understanding of the self, relationship with the self through practice, through spiritual practice, is literally what's required. It's necessary, and it's the only thing that will keep tyrannical power at bay, to put it simply. Obviously, drastically oversimplifying it compared to Foucault. But that's okay, because this is a podcast and not a philosophy lecture. I hope this is making sense, especially in the context of so many other things that we've talked about on the podcast or in my blog. I don't feel like I'm articulating it quite as well as I would like to, but I hope that something useful is being conveyed here. Now, in all of this, we might ask, what is the self? And I've talked about this before. The way I understand selfhood is as the observer, the witness, consciousness, pure consciousness, but consciousness that comes into individual form through each of us. The self, the subject, is a point of observation. It's not a material thing that can be defined or understood in thought or language. It is that which is aware and, exists only in the present, right, as the point of awareness. And this is also one of the reasons why I understand meditation as such a foundational practice, because most traditions of meditation, and this is certainly true of most Buddhist traditions as far as I understand them, as a non-expert, is to see meditation as a practice that helps us to properly discern between what truly is the self and what is not, right? The idea is that a great deal of suffering comes from this sort of mistaken identity of identifying with the material world, identifying with whatever, our body or what we do or the experiences we've had or, particular groups or particular politics or the way we look or the role we have, right? And those all, necessarily form our identity in a practical sense. But who we truly are, who the self, capital S is none of those things. It's nothing material. It's nothing definable. It's presence. It's the witness. It's the one experiencing all of those material things. but it isn't the material things. And so one way of understanding meditation is as a practice of noticing where we become entangled and identified with materiality and disentangling, separating, stepping back, recognizing that's not actually me. That's something I'm experiencing. That's something I'm witnessing, right? So we do this with thought, for example. We step back from our thoughts rather than identifying with thought as most of us do in our ordinary experience, right? Most of us think that our thoughts are thought by us and they are us. But in meditation, we can step back and observe the thought process and recognize I'm the one observing. I'm not those thoughts. Those thoughts are. They are an aspect of my experience, but they are not me. And this detachment that we receive through practice over time allows us a great deal of freedom in that, we're less likely to be tormented by that inner dialogue, right? We can, first of all, begin more and more to recognize when certain thoughts are arising that we may not want to participate in, right? Negative self-talk, cynicism, negativity, whatever it is, right? Thoughts that aren't necessarily helpful, right? Over the weeks and months and years that we practice meditation, it becomes a lot easier than in our ordinary day-to-day life to notice when those thoughts start arising and to say, oh, that's not me. I don't need to hold on to that. I don't need to believe that. I don't need to accept that, right? Maybe you've heard the saying, not everything you think is true, or something like that. How does it go? It's like, you don't have to believe your own thoughts, I think. And having this, just a little space in between the thought, right? Like, as over time we begin to notice our thoughts more, it also allows us to just have a little more spaciousness in our experience of reality, because we're not just in the thoughts, right? We're stepped back. The thought is a part of our experience. It's not the totality of experience. We don't have to allow ourselves to be taken over and taken away and controlled by these thought processes, right? Many of which aren't even our own, right? Many of these thought processes that happen seemingly automatically are just aspects of our conditioning, right? From our family, from our peers, from our culture, from media, etc. Certain forms of thought, certain patterns of thought, certain structures of thought come to be sort of ingrained, or we become accustomed to them, right? They become sort of easier to inhabit our space. So meditation offers us a little bit of space from that and a little bit of freedom over what thoughts we choose to think, right? Which thoughts we choose to hold on to. But meditation also allows us to detach from the body, from our sensory experience, right? And this is a sort of a paradox in a way, because, of course, many spiritual practices are also importantly about embodiment, right? About being more centered in the body, not so much in the mind, in the head, but being in our bodies, noticing the feelings that are arising, being present with our sensations. And so when we talk about detaching from the body, it's not to say to then escape into the mind, or conversely, to escape into the realms of light, right? There are spiritual practices that can function as dissociative mechanisms as a form of trauma response, right? So let's also acknowledge that, right? That some spiritual practice can be simultaneously profound and also a trauma response, in that it can take us out of our body, out of our experience, up into the angelic realms, right, where everything is perfect and beautiful. And there may be moments in which it is appropriate to do so, but, ultimately, we're here on earth for a reason, right? We're here in a body for a reason. We've incarnated for a reason, and it would be to disrespect the divine, to try to escape it, or to hate on the body, or to, not live this life, right, in the body on earth, right, to like neglect or dismiss or dislike even the body or human experience. That's not what we're talking about, right? And that has been a thread that has been, part of various spiritual traditions, and maybe Gnosticism is the most obvious example, where there has been this thread of hating on the body. Well, it's not even just Gnosticism. It's like most of Christianity, right? Which is taught that the body is somehow wrong or dirty or impure. But to my mind, there's multiple things going on there. There's a distortion. But in the cases, like in the Gnostic case, let's say, it not just a distortion, but perhaps a trauma response, right? And so I just want to acknowledge that. And I want to say that that's not what we're talking about when we talk about detaching from the body and yet being embodied, right? So meditation can allow us to observe what's going on in the body with detachment. So we're still present in the body. We actually are more embodied when we detach from it. Because what happens when we're in pain? Pain is such an ordinary part of experience, right? And for most of us, if there's pain in the body, it's very tempting to escape, right? To not be present with it, right? It's very understandable. And there may be times when that's entirely appropriate, right? But through meditation, we can learn how to observe what is arising, even if it's painful, even if it's pleasurable, without clinging on to it, without pushing it away, just to be present with what is, right? And it's just as important when it comes to pain as when it comes to pleasure, right? Because we're learning how to be present and not cling on or not push away, right? So those are two energies that are opposite but the same. They're both about attachment. Right? When we're trying to escape our own pain, that's also a form of attachment. Now, the truly profound thing is, and I don't have to convince you of this, because meditation truly is about trying the practice and observing the results for yourself. But for many people who do that, right, who engage in the practice and observe for themselves, we notice that sitting with our sensations has a transformative impact. So it's actually not just about presence. It's not just about embodiment. It's not just about detachment, but actually that form of consciousness of being present with, as the pure witness, without pushing away, without clinging on, just simply being present, has a transformative impact on what's being observed. That's where the real magic comes in. Because consciousness, pure consciousness, without judgment, without attachment, I believe, is the very definition of love. And love in action, meaning the act of observing in that way, in a loving way, in an unconditional way, the ability to be present with what is, allows what is to transform. And it even very often allows pain to shift and lessen and release. And I've certainly experienced this again and again and again because, as I've shared already, I had very intense chronic pain for very many years. And other practices were helpful too, but meditation was very key in that. And it was truly amazing to see how simply being present with my own pain would actually allow it to dissolve in many cases. Now, I'm not saying this is always the case, right? These things are extremely complex. And for me, a lot of my pain was the result of like bodily, like, forms of tension and clinging within the body that were tied to certain thought patterns. And there would be this sort of feedback effect then where I would start to feel pain and then I would actually resist the pain in my body. And so tense up even more, creating more pain. And so learning how to be present with what was arising in my body without tensing up, without resisting it, was truly transformative. And I know that sounds like a very specific example, but I think that's actually extremely common where we get into these feedback loops within our own being, whether in the body, whether in the mind, where we kind of end up creating and amplifying our own pain, which isn't to say that all pain is that, right? Obviously, not all pain is self-inflicted in that way. But I think a lot of it is more than we may realize before we begin practicing, right? But many of us who have a spiritual practice, we start to realize that we actually have a lot more say over our own lives than we may have realized. We actually have a lot more power than we may have realized. We truly do empower ourselves through taking the responsibility to be disciplined in our practice. And I use the word discipline on purpose. I know that it's sort of a loaded term and has a negative connotation for a lot of people. And let's understand that, so many of these things have been distorted, right? So we have this picture of discipline as something that we have to force upon ourselves or that is forced upon us from the external world. And we are learning to operate in a way that is not forceful, that is not violent, right? Because that is a form of violence. And yet, if we do away with the concept of discipline altogether, we will not be free. We will not be happy. There is no happiness without discipline, I believe. Self-discipline, right? And self-discipline is very importantly different from being disciplined. But self-discipline as, in some cases, delayed gratification, right? Self-discipline to engage in a daily practice. The self-discipline around what thoughts we allow into our space, right? Around being ethical. Those forms of self-discipline are the necessary ingredients for a good life, for happiness even, for inner peace, for harmony. That's definitely been my experience. And it's not about forcing yourself to do something, right? But there are ways to do these things that can be gentle. So, on a more practical level, let me share a couple of my own ways of kind of tricking myself into practice. So I do practice meditation every morning. And what really helped me initially was to observe how different my days would go on the days where I would meditate and the days where I didn't. And it was such a stark contrast that, experiencing that over and over and over again really was so reinforcing and helping me to cultivate a daily practice. there was a period in my life where on the days that I didn't meditate, at some point I would end up in tears, inevitably, just for any kind of reason, right? Whatever, frustration, depression, despair, and then there would be some kind of story that would populate that energy that would lead to tears. And on the days that I did meditate, that wouldn't happen. And it was just such a perfect correlation. Like it really was exactly a 1-to-1 correlation. When I meditated, I wouldn't cry. When I didn't meditate, I would cry. And it's like a little, I almost feel silly saying it because like I'm not saying that this will be anyone else's experience, but the point is just that somehow reality made it so obvious to me. It gave me this measure, right? The measure of crying. And it just, I couldn't argue with my experience. It was just so obvious that meditation was impacting me in a good way, right? It would allow me to move through my days with a little more ease, a little more softness, a little less turmoil, a little more peace. And over time, over decades, that really does build on itself, right? To the point where I feel peaceful now. I feel genuinely happy, which is not to be like in a great mood all the time and ecstatic all the time, right? I don't see happiness in that way. It's more like a form of contentment. So, okay, that's the first thing that was so helpful for me on a practical level in cultivating a daily practice, was just witnessing the profound impact that it had on my life. And so that's something we can all experiment with on our own, right? You don't have to take it from me. You can try a practice and notice, how do you feel on the days you practice? How do you feel when you don't? And some people say, I don't have the time. But the thing is, it actually will give you time. It really will. Like, in sort of the simplest way, meditation helps us with focus. And, maybe you do a 10 or 20-minute practice in the morning. If you have greater focus throughout the day, think about how much time you'll save. Fewer distractions, right? Fewer getting caught up in scrolling. Fewer inner dialogues that take you off track. Fewer moments of just inner turbulence. More patience and presence as you engage with your life. Like, those things give you time. Okay, sorry if I'm being a little preachy. I just it's been so profound for me, and I just wish for others to experience the peace of mind and the inner transformation that I have, Okay, second practical thing that I do that helps me to maintain a daily practice is I trick myself. I tell myself it doesn't matter how long, I just have to begin. So as long as I sit down and meditate for 2 minutes, that's all that's required. I just have to do something. And once I've sat down and done 2 minutes, usually, well, for me at this point, it's always longer than that. At this point, honestly, I have to set a timer to stop myself from meditation, because after doing this practice for so many years, it's no longer difficult. It's no longer something I have to make myself do. I do still have to kind of convince myself to begin. And so this trick is still helpful, right? I only have to do a minute or two. And so for me at this point, it's easy to sit for 30, 40, 60 minutes. But when you're first beginning, it's normal that that's not easy. It's normal that, you may want to get up after 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and that's perfectly okay. So consistency is more important than length of time, right? So it doesn't matter how long you sit, just start sitting every day, every morning, or every evening, whenever it is, right? Daily practice, ideally, is key. And I do the same with my yoga practice. I practice yoga every afternoon, but I trick myself because I don't usually feel like it. But I say, it doesn't matter how long I practice for. It doesn't matter how intense the practice is. I just have to get onto my mat. If I just sit there in child's pose for 10 minutes and that's it, that's it. But it never is that, because the difficulty is in beginning. Once I'm on my mat, once I've done some child pose, once I've allowed myself to soften into the moment and into my body and into sensation, once I've allowed myself to take a few deep breaths, then movement and breath not only comes easy, but is enjoyable. It's what I naturally, spontaneously want to be doing. So there are ways that we can kind of trick ourselves, because I don't think that approaching these things from like a forceful kind of self-discipline sort of mindset is helpful or conducive to long-term practice, right? So how can we be self-disciplined in a gentle, loving, compassionate way? The doors are now open to join my practice-based membership, The Secret Art. We're going to be meeting multiple times a month for astrology circles, guided meditations, energy work practices, Q&A hangouts. It's going to be lots of fun. It's also going to support us all in our spiritual practice, in our psychic development, in our personal evolution. I'm so excited. I hope you can join us. Find more info by clicking the link in the show notes. I am giving away some gift memberships for people who want to try it out for free in the beginning for the first 2 months. So if you're intrigued but not sure and think you want to kind of feel it out first, just send me an email and I'll be happy to send you a link.